What if the secret to funding the biggest army in history wasn't gold mines or rich allies, but just winning and then sending the invoice? Napoleon didn't just conquer Europe. He made Europe pay for its own conquest. Let that sink in for a second. Most people think about Napoleon and picture cannons, cavalry, and dramatic battlefield moments. And yeah, all of that happened. But there's a much colder, more calculated story happening behind the scenes, one that involves collapsing currencies, massive war bills, and the financial model so ruthless it makes modern hedge funds look soft. So let's go back to 1799. Napoleon just seized power in France, and here's what he inherited: a country that was completely broke. Not tight budget broke. We're talking financially traumatized. How did France get here? Well, it started decades earlier. The 7 Years' War drained the treasury. Then France backed the American Revolution, which cost them roughly 1.3 billion livres. By 1788, France was spending more than half of its entire royal revenue just on interest payments. Just the interest, not the actual debt. Just the interest. And when you can't pay your bills, things get messy fast. The monarchy didn't fall purely because of big ideas about liberty. It fell because it was financially insolvent. Then the revolution happened, and someone had a brilliant idea. Let's just print money backed by church land we've confiscated. They called it the assignat. At first, it kind of made sense. Turn seized property into liquidity, stabilize the economy, everyone wins. Except they printed way too much of it. By 1795, over 45 billion livres worth of assignats had been issued. Prices exploded, savings disappeared overnight. The currency basically disintegrated. If there were a gold medal for financial improvisation under pressure, revolutionary France would have briefly claimed it, right before the currency collapsed. So this is what Napoleon walked into: a nation exhausted by war, terror, and hyperinflation. And here's what made Napoleon genuinely different from other ambitious conquerors of his time. He understood something crucial. You cannot run a war machine on monetary chaos. His first move? Not another invasion. Stabilization. In 1800, he created the Bank of France. In 1803, he introduced the franc germinal, a new metallic currency backed by gold and silver. Stable, predictable, credible. He centralized tax collection, modernized administration, cracked down on corruption. In the early years of his rule, the French budget was actually often balanced. Ponder that for a second. Napoleon, the guy known for endless wars, was running a surprisingly disciplined fiscal operation at home. But here's the pivot that changes everything. Napoleon refused to let French citizens carry the full financial burden of his wars. So instead, he exported the bill. Every time he won a major battle, the losing country had to pay. And we're not talking symbolic gestures here. We're talking crushing, structured financial transfers. After defeating Austria in 1805, the Treaty of Pressburg demanded 40 million francs in reparations. After humiliating Prussia in 1807, the Treaty of Tilsit imposed roughly 120 million francs in contributions. To put that in perspective, France's annual military budget at the time was around 600 to 700 million francs. A single post-battle invoice could fund months of war. Napoleon's model was almost elegant in its brutality. Conquer a territory, impose an indemnity, station French troops there at the occupied country's expense, extract cash, grain, horses, supplies, then use all of that to fund the next campaign. War financed war. German states in the Confederation of the Rhine supplied both troops and money. Italy funded French garrisons. Holland bore heavy financial burdens. Spain, before it rebelled, was pulled into the system. This wasn't looting, it was structured extraction. Napoleon turned conquest into cash flow. But here's the thing about that kind of system. Do you see the hidden problem? It required constant expansion. As long as Napoleon kept winning, new revenue streams kept opening up. Each victory funded the next mobilization. Stop winning, and the whole thing starts to crack. The empire functioned like a highly leveraged growth strategy. Growth covered liabilities, victory justified extraction, expansion maintained liquidity. Sound familiar? And Napoleon had one more trick up his sleeve: the continental system. After failing to defeat Britain at sea, seriously, Trafalgar was a disaster for France. Napoleon tried to destroy Britain economically instead. In 1806, through the Berlin Decree, he banned all European nations under French control from trading with Britain, strangled British exports, collapsed their economy, forced them to surrender. Clever in theory. In practice, it backfired spectacularly. European economies were deeply woven into British trade networks. Textiles, manufactured goods, colonial imports, all of it flowed through British channels. Cutting those links didn't just hurt Britain, it hurt Europe too. Smuggling exploded, black markets flourished, coastal regions just ignored the rules. Russia, increasingly frustrated by the economic damage, eventually started violating the continental system openly. And that defiance set the stage for the most catastrophic financial decision of Napoleon's career. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with approximately 600,000 troops, the largest army Europe had ever seen. And it was financially devastating before a single major battle was even fought, because supply lines stretched for thousands of kilometers. Provisioning that many men required resources on a staggering scale, and the campaign just didn't produce the quick, decisive victory Napoleon needed. Winter came, men died, the retreat was catastrophic. Fewer than 100,000 men returned in any fighting condition. And here's the financial gut punch. The entire model depended on victorious campaigns generating revenue. Russia generated nothing but cost. No indemnity, no tribute, no new revenue stream. Just a massive drain on manpower, supplies, and morale. After 1812, the machine started breaking down. France could no longer convert battlefield momentum into cash flow. The satellite states began hesitating. Resistance movements intensified. And Britain, operating on a different financial model, stepped in to bankroll the opposition. See, Britain wasn't funding its wars through conquest and extraction. It was funding them through credit markets, long-term government bonds called consols. Investors bought British debt because they trusted Parliament would repay it. The Bank of England provided institutional continuity. British debt soared past 200% of GDP by 1815, which is insane, but it remained serviceable because the system was built on institutional trust, not expansion. Napoleon's model was dynamic but fragile. Britain's was slower but scalable. By 1813, the coalition was pushing back decisively. The Battle of Leipzig, called the Battle of Nations, saw hundreds of thousands of troops clash in Central Europe. And here's the critical shift. Once Napoleon's army started retreating, the indemnity payment stopped. France suddenly faced massive war expenses with no external financing to absorb them. The burden came home, and France faced the same structural problem that had destroyed the monarchy in 1788. War is expensive. Revenue is finite. When Napoleon finally abdicated in 1814, briefly returning in 1815 before Waterloo ended it permanently, France didn't just lose politically. The entire financial logic of the empire collapsed with it. The country that had imposed indemnities across Europe was now required to pay 700 million francs in war reparations. Allied occupation forces stayed in France until payments were secured. The model had completely inverted. Now, why does any of this matter today? Because the pattern Napoleon discovered and exploited hasn't disappeared. It just wears different clothes. Great powers today still attempt to shift costs beyond their borders. Economic sanctions redirect financial pressure outward. Trade policies move burdens across supply chains. Currency dominance allows nations to attract global capital and finance deficits at scale. The ability to externalize cost is power, but it is also conditional. Napoleon's empire functioned exactly like a leveraged growth strategy. Growth covered obligations. Victory justified extraction. Expansion maintained liquidity. When growth reversed, leverage crushed the structure. Modern governments operate on similar dynamics, issuing debt under the assumption that future growth will service it. Central banks providing liquidity to prevent contraction from cascading. Capital flows stabilizing imbalances until they don't.
Napoleon needed new territory to fund old obligations. Modern systems need new growth to service old debt. The arithmetic is different, the logic isn't. And here's the more subtle lesson that often gets overlooked. Napoleon wasn't financially reckless in the traditional sense. He stabilized currency. He modernized administration. He improved tax collection. He corrected many of the mistakes the revolution made. But his entire strategic model assumed that political dominance would indefinitely produce economic extraction. He built a growth model without a plateau strategy. He had no plan for what happens when expansion stops. Once Europe coordinated against him, financially and militarily, the model collapsed. The coalition powers didn't just defeat France with armies, they financed resistance through Britain's capital markets. British subsidies funded continental forces. Debt became ammunition. Money and power were inseparable. And that's a lesson that applies at every scale, not just empires. Financial freedom at the individual level follows the same rule. Growth strategies that depend on constant external inflow, rising asset prices, speculative momentum, borrowed leverage, can look unstoppable for a long time. But when inflow slows, fragility appears fast. Systems built on disciplined cash flow and structural resilience outlast cycles, always. The real question to sit with is this: are you building something that requires constant momentum to survive, or something that can hold its ground when the momentum stops? Napoleon's empire was spectacular. It was fast. It was innovative. It mobilized half a continent. But it required motion. The moment motion stopped, the bill arrived. History doesn't punish ambition. It punishes unsustainable financing. The Napoleonic era wasn't ultimately about cannons and cavalry. It was about balance sheets and bond markets, about who paid, who extracted, and who endured. The real empire wasn't the one that conquered the most land. It was the one that mastered credit. And that lesson, that institutional trust outlasts conquest-based financing, is still playing out today, every single day, in bond markets, central banks, and geopolitical decisions that most people never even hear about. If this gave you a new way of seeing history and maybe your own finances, hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here.